Good afternoon, everyone. I hope it is fine if I keep my video off. This will help with streaming, because of the weak network that we get here. It is always a greater pleasure for me to share my work and experience with the audiences of the region because I feel that way we could gain more, benefit from this exchange of idea mostly because you know there are so many common threads and similar challenges that we face when we are engaging with writing the history of the region, particularly when we are trying to write history of the people and the tribal communities who have for a very long time been often rendered historyless, largely because either they do not fit the dominant narratives of the history, or else because they do not have the so-called historical artifacts and written accounts or records that historians usually consider as historical data and evidence. So, without further ado, I would like to read my paper, which should give you the overview of the kind of work I have been doing and the scope of my work and my observation and my own learning based on my own research, oral history research among the Apatani community and other communities in Arunachal Pradesh on different topics. So I'm very sure that after this paper reading, there will be more discussions because you will the all the esteemed students will realize that there are so many similar issues that we deal with when we are writing about history, and then a method like oral history, which has been, which existed for a very long time but has not been used, and there is a constant debate even within the larger history uh, discipline of history that if oral history should be considered as a valid method or not, a valid and legitimate method or not. uh, let's keep that open for us, especially for us, as I mentioned earlier, that uh, uh, the kind of artifacts and records that the discipline of history requires. Uh, in case of tribal communities, those materials are not available. What we have is our oral traditions and our memories. So I'll start my reading my paper. I think I might have changed the title a little bit, but it should not matter much. So the topic of the paper that I'm going to read is historical sense and ethnographic conversations, intricacies of doing oral history in Arunachal Pradesh. As postmodern and post-colonial historiography is no more preoccupied with universal statements or theories, it is moving towards integrating itself more with more multidisciplinary approaches and decentralizing the locations of history writing. As a result, new alternative histories and even multiple interpretations of history are emerging. In particular, the history that are coming from the erstwhile suppressed, marginalized, subaltern, or colonized indigenous groups of people. In case of the Northeast India, today more and more native indigenous people have started to uh, contribute by either rewriting or deconstructing and decolonizing the histories, bringing newer senses of understanding the past, bringing insiders' perspective and its multiple locations. My today's lecture will try to further broaden the scope of history writing in the region, specifically among the tribal communities, by proposing a more people-centric method called the oral history method. This is particularly helpful and necessary for writing history of indigenous communities who have rich memories, both personal and social. The dominant historical evidences, such as the artifacts and archives, might only represent and contribute only to the dominant narratives of history and dominant group of people. Unlike the dominant history method, oral history brings a unique understanding to the voice claim of the speaker over the fact based truth claims. While the former criticizes historians' method as overindulgent in subjective and interpretive narratives, oral historian sees the oral history narratives as a product of lived experiences mediated through subjective interpretations. It is a discursive articulation of the past between memory and reality. It is such discursive dialogue or articulation that helps in discovering meanings of an experience and often invoke an inarticulate memory and past. Such past, which are messy, sometimes elusive, often hybrid, but mostly unarchived. They provide the alternative narratives, the subaltern's versions, and history of people who are excluded from the domains of dominant and statist historiographies. In words of Alessandro Portelli, one of the prominent proponent of oral history, I quote, oral histories are not necessarily speaking and challenging the written and official narratives. It challenges the fixity of written account as a lie. Quote ends. Thus, oral history has the capacity to democratize the history by bringing the voices that was earlier unrepresented and by bringing ordinary people's narrative to the fore in the making of or retrieving the dominant narrative, revisiting the dominant narrative. In my understanding, what I have learned from my own experience of doing oral history research among the tribal communities in Arunachal, there are some unique challenges and opportunities. Oral history's narratives are pool of experiences and knowledges which are also molded by various other factors among the tribal communities in Arunachal, and I believe among the communities in Nagaland as well. Such factors could be sociocultural and environmental context, their political stance, the semiotic of their language, the communitarian worldview, and years of socialization under the governmentality of the nation state. And in a unique way, these traditions have been discursively shaping their worldview, identity, consciousness, cognition, articulation, and linguistic structures and practices. Such information which never makes the pages of history are crucial indicators of causal forces in background of events and action that earmarks the history. This paper is based on the oral history interviews that took place between 2013 and 2019 among the Tanu communities of Arunachal Pradesh. Drawing from this field data and experiences, this paper will try to explicate the complex content of oral narratives of oral histories in a traditional and culturally dense environment. According to Raymond Madden, a good ethnographer should use their body as an organic recording device, which registers and observes the surrounding. It should hear, smell, touch, and feel to perceive the domains of these conversations. The conversations, tacit social norms, moods, nuances, politics, and historical time and trend. These all together forms the context, which in turn creates the meaning. While interacting, the oral history researcher must simultaneously discern what is being communicated and what is not. What semiotic structures are determining the frame of these conversations? What craft of mind and cognitive memory process are involved in leading and creating these conversations? What experiences and contexts are determining their sharing? My study among the Tanu communities of Arunachal, I would like to mention here that, my community, Tamil community is officially recorded as Apatani, but we address ourselves or recognize ourselves as Tanu. So I am only using the term Tanu here. Otherwise, if you are looking for searching elsewhere, then you should look for Apatani. My study among my own Tanu community of Arunachal Pradesh concerning an event called Kure Chambio in 1949. The Kure Chambio, in short, was the first open violent clash between Tanu men and Indian military. Tanu people did not like the growing presence and interference of outsiders in their valley. To them, the independence of India and shuffling of rule, returning of colonial rulers, had no meaning. The event culminated into the annexation of Tanu homeland, which was followed by rapid succession of similar occupations in the entire region of Arunachal. During this occupation and succession periods of Tanu homeland by the Indian government, various oppressive tactics and measures were employed by then officials to establish the military and administrative base of the government against those who were resistant. This was also simultaneously carried with various trust and allegiance building processes, such as appointment of various local influential people as political agents, gaon buras, and kotokis, and benevolent welfare activities such as opening of schools, dispensary, cooperative shops, etc., were carried out. Decades later, during my research, the speakers were still worried about speaking about the past, especially about the Kure Chambio event against the government. Many had spoken about the event for the first time in many years. However, this paper will focus specifically on the complex socio-cultural domain of interview environment when layers of meanings were being revealed, and also discuss the unique challenges of doing an oral history among an oral community, where I'm also an insider and my identity itself became a factor in the narrative construction. To begin with, the village elders I was interviewing spoke in older form of Tamil language, which is very difficult, which is very different from the form that what we commonly use. The colloquial Tamil is very different. The language I speak or my contemporary speak is very different from the language our elders speak in. I'm sure that many of you are also familiar with the dilemma where you feel our elders speak almost a different dialect. They use very different set of narrative dixes and point of references drawn from a different pool of experience belonging to their time or generation. Thus, their language itself seems largely inaccessible to my generation. As a result, one gets concerned about getting enough information and interpreting and presenting the voices true to its speaker. Then the tedious processes of knowledge production, such as transcription, translation, analysis, interpretation, and then their academic textual representation, with so much loss in between these transitions, pose serious problem in giving and maintaining the agency to the speaker's history. To give an example for our further discussion, here is a note from one of my oral history interviews to highlight or underpin various aspects of how these conversations looked like in field, in actual, and how over the period these conversations also went through its own transition. I'm using the case of Tada. I have changed the name of the person. He was an elderly person, and 3 years back he passed away. So here is my note that I had prepared after my field work, and during the time of my data processing. Padutada. Several people suggested me to meet Padutada. He was in his late 80s when I had interviewed him. He used to be a well regarded village priest who, after converting to Christianity, gave up his priesthood. He is known for his extensive knowledge of both Miji, meaning knowledge of spirit or non living world, and Migung, meaning knowledge, particularly historical knowledge, of human and living world. With a specialization, I mean, he was specialized in something called Kadi Migung, which is a history of the land. My interests in interview with Padutada were focused around gaining more information and understanding about few important leaders of the past, namely Kagobida Nadariku of Hija village and Padilanyang of Bula village. They were the first Gamburas appointed by British officials in 1943 and then promoted as the head Gamburas by the Indian administrators post independence. They were influential village members and happened to have forged good relation with Christopher Hemmendorf, who was then appointed as a special officer for Subansiri region, now known as Lower Subansiri district. They had changed the course of way of life in the valley through their alliances with the government. They also enjoyed strong support in their respective village and administrators trusted them well. My meeting with Padutada followed by the regular routine as it used to happen with other elders when I interviewed them. During the initial periods, they would generally test my knowledge and understanding of the traditions, and often based on my language skills, they would easily gauge that I was an educated fool. As I failed to impress him, he declined to give me time, but after seeing that I was persistent, he agreed to speak to me only in the presence of his daughter Kari. She's a medical nurse by profession. She was trained under her father on traditional knowledge, but also empathically understood my situation. So she was able to ask the right questions in right ways and listened intently when he spoke, and then translated it to me in simple Tamil language. She would also know exactly when I will have a problem and explain things even before I asked. Padutada would not even look at me, but listen carefully while Kari is translating or explaining things to me, and time to time nod in approval. However, one evening my father dropped in to pick me up on his way back from some meeting. The presence of another male member had significantly altered the order of communication into a more gendered alignment. There was a significant transformation in the composer of Tada. While the content matter was now politically leveled up by few notches, the language became symbolically denser and aesthetically more ornate. In presence of another male member, he was at ease and even started bragging about his past political life. Now he could talk about real politics with another man who is appropriated who is appropriate for such talks. Padutada, who till the entry of my father told me about those three early Gaumburas in a matter of factly way, now in presence of my father reveals that he himself was at Gambura and worked very closely with those three stalwarts. What I noted later, while I was trying to analyze the narratives, that there was a significant difference in the narrative style now. The source of his language pool was different. Tada was now personalizing their unique characteristic with his own observations. He explained that to be a good Gambura, one needs a good oratory skills, good memory and knowledge of history, as one needs to learn from the past. I quote him. He says, "While wise words of orator brings peace, careless words filled with arrogance may turn the good wind into and give air to the fire." Quote end. He shares when one gets to team with other good orators and people like these three stalwarts, they can work wonders and become so powerful that they become the judge rather than a mere negotiator or mediator. Then, drawing several ornamental and symbolic parallels, he explained the unique personalities and styles of those three leaders. He first spoke about Kagobida, and I quote him here. Quote starts, Ayya, that Kagobida was the gentlest of all three. He was gentle in person and gentle in his words. He spoke like someone who carefully twisting the cotton fibers between fingers to spun thread out of cotton bale. With gentle twisting and caressing with words, uh, he used the term mulyam mulyam pilyam pilyam. With gentle twisting and caressing with words, his words could calm down any ruffled heart. Then he comes to speak about Nadarika. He says, Nadarika's words were firm like the sticks fastened with foal for sacrifice that are stuck to the agyang. Agyang is the ritual altar that we build whenever we perform certain ceremonies, for especially for making, especially for sacrificing chicks or other cows, dogs, and others. No? So usually the priest would construct a bamboo altar. So this is where that stick, which is fastened to a chicken, and is very firmly placed in these altars. There is so I'll just sorry I'll just continue with the uh, paper. There is no and I'm continuing his quote. There is no escape from the way he frames his argument. The stick must be firmly stuck so that it bears the entire weight and struggle put by chicken to escape. He was a man of few words, but no one could dislodge his points. Then, with a great endearment, he talks about Padilalyang. He says, Ah, Padilalyang, people are right when they call him as the public leader. He was always joyful and jolly, and yet very prudent. No one could dislike him because of his nature. He was someone who could bring everyone together and shelter them under his arms like a mother hen. He spreads his hand arms and show how a mother hen would cover and shelter the chicks under her wing. So what do we draw from above stories? First thing is that the narrative of lived experience and simulations, uh, uh, the very dense and rich analogies that one brings from their lived experience. The imageries of Tada's speech are drawn from his own domain of reality, memory, and experiences that might produce and reproduce meaning that are meaningful only to him and for those who share that domain of experience. The esoteric meaning and depth of those meaning can be understood only by understanding his domain of meaning. Further, these symbolic expressions are drawn from both the meaning of the act and from the act itself, which means someone who experiences them practically can understand the depth of those meaning. All three expressions or analogies used by him are gradually becoming rare for the community's experience, as the community is going through waves of transformation. Each wave is adding or taking away from these lived experiences of past. Tada was making a constant crisscross between his memory from the past and their depiction from the imagery of his day-to-day life. These imageries for a person who do not have this lived experience would be difficult to grasp the message or meaning conveyed in them. When a speaker is consciously and unconsciously acting under so many domains of social, cultural, and political relations, it is difficult to gauge what aspects of life he or she is opening. It was the chance situation of my father dropping in that revealed so many facts in one hand, and on the other hand, about the quality of those facts, the linguistic ornamental attributions, which explain so many things about the experience and environment of the speaker, but also reveals the narrative domains and referral points of the speaker themselves during this entire act of speaking. You might wonder why it is important to understand or keep on account of the quality of those facts. I'll share another instance about an elderly man I interviewed given who was given the responsibility for retrieving the dead body of a person who was shot and killed during the Kure attack. He was very old and already had deteriorating memory when I met him. I had visited him several times already, but one day he was narrating and recollecting the moment when he saw the dead body in the forest. It was already rotting. This dead body is of the person who was shot dead by the Indian Army when the Kure attack happened. So he was, and as we were talking, and he started, remembering, recollecting that moment when he first saw the dead body, and yeah, it was already rotting, and he saw a giant insect nibbling the flesh near the empty eye socket. He was deeply affected by the memory, and he repeated the same sight several times during some 40 minutes conversation. It was part of his traumatic visual memory, which was involuntarily recurring, and he would involuntarily speak out. On the first look, the entire transcript of my interview, on the first look at the entire transcript of my interview with him, he seemed to be someone who have moved on from the past experiences and was telling me stories from the wisdom of present. It takes a long engagement and process of trust building when people uh, open up about their vulnerabilities and traumas. And sometimes it takes deeper insight on person's life and their social and historical surrounding to understand the context of what is being spoken and what is not being spoken. Another interesting and important observation of my research was in relation to my interviews with elderly women of the community. Their narrative voices became significant light holder to aspects that was not being shared by men of the community. Unlike men in 1950s and 70s who were engaging either voluntarily or by compulsion with the government officials and were being politically socialized to new order of governance and domination, women largely stayed within their respective villages, busy with their household or agricultural works. Fortunately, they were ignored even by the administrators. So they did not go through the similar kind of socialization that all men were going through. So I found their narrative attitude towards the outsider and their activities different from how men were presenting themselves. They were more vocal and frank in their articulation of oppression and fear and struggles caused by the Hayang or the non-tribal tribals. When there is so much denial of injuries by many of the community members about the past, it is important to keep the account of pain, loss, trauma, silence, and suppression to understand what happened. How how had this community experienced it in the past, and what they are saying now in retrospective from a distance. There are the narratives or facts without its quality might not tell you the whole story or the other stories, especially about those who are not speaking or are not allowed to speak. Um, this is a new edition that I had put in this paper about my experience as a, female researcher. Uh, it has many implications, being a woman who is researching even within her community. So we have traditions, oral traditions, where certain aspects of society or history or oral tradition or past are not shared with women. They are not allowed to, either listen to all these stories, because they are considered as, aru. Aru would be stories or knowledge which consist of, death, and especially, violent death. Hmm. So women are not supposed to hear all those stories. So I thought this is very important aspect, that because it affects how how you are collecting your data, and what is being shared, and how it has several implications on your research. So I'm calling this subtopic as gendered fences. Though the term gendered fences is too simplistic to define the predicaments of female researchers, however, it is necessary to bring it on table for discussion in whichever term possible at the moment. Not many female researchers have exclusively brought out the issue on as how being a female researcher, her chances in the field are differently affected. Irrespective of what state of mind the female researcher is in terms of her sexuality, education, age, belief, interests, and the other research participants views her through their own locations, guided by their own gendered norms and beliefs. Such norms invariably affect the access, sometimes by making it easier to access stories from women's perspective, or on aspects that the particular society considers as proper and meant to be beyond women's domain, where women is often fenced out. According to Tanu oral tradition, traditional norms, certain genres of oral traditions in Miji and Migum are restricted for women. Several taboos are attached to women being weaker, not only physically but also in her soul and spirit, which makes them vulnerable to attacks from the evil or destructive spirits. Simultaneously, due to patriarchal biases and fixed gender roles, women are discouraged from learning and performing oral traditions. Women in general do not have space or representations in decision making or in political processes. Specifically, there are no formal spaces where a woman can pursue or perform the oral traditions, especially the ones which are considered as sacred. Very often, I was told politely that I need not know certain informations or stories about the past or certain traditions, as they would not be useful for me. The village elders, or the ones who are considered as an expert in oral traditions, often did not take me seriously during initial phase of the fieldwork, or often find it amusing that I, being a woman, should be interested in such subject. Thus, uh, oral history approach provides a penetrative tool or a frame of research that lead one into people's experiences. It provides the liberating tool that empower voices and validates divergences and subjective truths. Here, the subjective reality and their meaning are co-created by people, their experiences, their socio-political and cultural context together. My experience of doing oral history interview with Padutada was complex one, though not a unique one, as it was a typical experience I had with many in the co- I had with many in the community. It was only during the transcribing process of the interview records, when multiple overlapping domains and layers of meaning became evident. The oral history narrations of this study was taking place in a culturally laden narratives. Uh, uh, Professor Saikya or Abhirupa, how much time do I have?
Ma'am, you can continue for another 10 minutes
Okay.
or so.
Yes, yes.
All right. All
Yes.
right.
Yes.
I think then I will try to skip few parts. Um, okay. Okay. um, then one very important part is that whenever when I was teaching research methodology and whenever I spoke about oral history method, so many people mixes or confuses between oral history and oral traditions. So people from the communities, they know that oral traditions are very different. Oral histories are generally the history or memory or narratives that is part of the lived experience, their own personal or first-hand experiences. Oral traditions are, there is no time, there is no what landmarks of time, there's a periods, this period, that period, and before this, and then during the time of our ancestors. That's how oral traditions are spoken about. And the purpose of oral traditions and oral histories are also different. So uh, so here I would like to discuss a little bit about oral traditions. Why in Apatani community? Why? Because uh, when I'm doing oral history among a community whom I also call as oral community because of our rich oral traditions. Hmm. So as I shared earlier, that our narrative, when people are speaking and sharing about their experiences of past, they are uh, they are always constantly being molded by the traditions of oral the traditions or of oral traditions, how and what and why uh, uh, the stories are to be shared, you know and so that's why whenever somebody is engaging with oral history method with communities who have all very strong and rich oral traditions, you need to have a very good understanding of how oral traditions functions, no, in the society, and how social and cultural norms affect the narrations. So continuing with my paper, Tanu believes that the ability to learn and speak and perform oral tradition is an inborn gift that is bestowed by birth by a group of spirit called as Charung. A person blessed by Charung is considered to be gifted with immense thirst for learning, good grasping capacity, uh, strong memory, and great skills of oration. They are wise and often possess. They are wise people and often possess beautiful singing voice. The Charu is also a protecting spirit against the evil spirits or destructive souls who might be unintentionally invoking, who might be unintentionally invoked during their oral performances. Hence, the layperson, and particularly women, is often restricted from narrating them without proper precautions. Uh, Thus, such formalization, in one hand, crystallizes the structure of different traditions, oral traditions, or genres of traditions that we have, and the contents, which ensures its fixity on one hand. It also ensures its exclusivity by restricting its common phrase recitation. The such norms and conventions that cognitively guides its performers present challenges for researchers who do not have such knowledge and expertise and yet depend largely on oral narrations. However, ironically, the other characteristic of oral traditions among the Tanu is that is their dynamic nature, the dynamic nature of oral traditions. Being an oral community, Tanus have been recording and preserving their history and knowledge through their oral traditions. But it is important to note these traditions are also living traditions, as the community practices them through their day-to-day life. through their cultivation practices, conflict resolution systems, the governance system, marriage, and other social institutions during the time of transactions, land use and practices, clothing, healing, etc. However, what is also inevitable is the changeability of the social context and environment, sometimes due to sudden turmoil or conflict or natural calamity, and most of the time slow but steady transformations along the line of quote so-called progress that the society go through. As their socio-cultural, political, and environmental realities changes, the oral traditions are also bound to change and interpreted differently at different times, making it a dynamic and responsive, making it dynamic and responsive to environment. Dynamism is required for maintaining their relevance to ensure the sustainability of these traditions. For instance, the migration history of Tanakol Rego Migung talks about centuries of movement by the community in various stages of settlements and development in different locations. Each of these stages with no definite time marking, but rather a duration of change. Through their complex stories of spirits and human interactions, marks the origin of institutions and practices, incorporations of certain beliefs and genealogical divisions at each stage in different environment and challenges to them. And thus, accordingly, over the period, there has been newer addition and reinterpretation which were embedded and formalized to core narrative threads. The ever-changing environment and lived realities compels the dynamism, where there is a constant reinterpretation and reconstitution taking place as the time changes. Okay, so in my concluding remarks, the oral narrations or communication among oral communities are distinctively influenced in terms of their contents as well as in style by their oral traditions, which in the end affects the information that is being shared and their possible analysis and interpretation. In my experience, I found that the speakers, while narrating a story, was not mechanically verbalizing the past as a fixed and framed narratives. The speakers are formulating the sentences in a language which has its own unique cultural syntax and semiotics. They use conceptual meaning that are unique to their cultural context. Thus, among Tamil, there is a binary relation between oral tradition and oral skills. While speaking and sharing the information, the speakers often rework and reformulate their narratives to make sense to present or frame them into more modern terms to make it understandable to its audience. While this provides an opportunity for researchers to enter into the repository of past knowledge, but it drastically filters out the cognitive reality and meaning of the context when they were created. A perceptive and careful researchers thus should have a very good grasping of these complexities and different nuances. Every engagement with an indigenous, oral, and ethnic community is an ethnographic engagement where, along with the spoken words, it is the entire surrounding and environment and all accumulated history and cultural background that speaks. One needs to give, very intent and close ear to these voices. The intention of this paper is to open up and invite further discussions pertaining to problems of writing history of traditional and tribal communities. The sensitive representation of these histories and the voices and their identities is a challenge even for an insider and should be more so for an outsider. Oral history writing is sensitive towards subjective interpretation by its narrator itself. Unlike the narrative among the non-traditional or non-indigenous communities, narratives in traditional, oral, and indigenous communities are always bound by the terms of oral traditions and cultural norms. Their generation, oration, their experience and interpretations takes place within a specific cultural context, which carries a clear bearing on the speaker, especially on the traditional experts. Therefore, co-writing the history would mean to write the history by what it means to the people to whom it belongs. Without the speaker's voice, an historian oblivious to such cultural complex of embedded and nuanced narratives, who might not even know what he or she do not know, and is basically writing his or her own her own history, not about whom they are writing. I think here my paper ends.
Thank you so much, ma'am, for your intricate lecture. Now, I request our participants that the platform is open for questions. So, if you have any questions or doubts, ma'am would love to answer them. So, please, if you have any questions, you can leave them in the chat box. Ma'am, our first question is, ma'am, can you please explain what are the problems and prospects of oral writing?
Okay, Abhirupa, should we collect
Yes,
some questions together, or should I go ahead with one-to-one questions?
ma'am, as you feel comfortable, if you would like to wait for one more or so. Is
Hmm.
there anyone who would like to ask any other question? Then you can
Okay,
leave them in the chat box.
okay. Hmm. All right. I think I'll try to address this question.
Yes, ma'am.
Avi Akivili Akivili is asking the question. Akivili,
Yeah, yes.
do you mean oral history writing or oral writing? Not very clear what exactly you mean.
Ma'am, oral history writing.
Okay, okay. Hmm. So when we are doing oral history interviews, what basically we are doing is, what basically we are doing is asking somebody to narrate their experience of past or a very specific event. Hmm. So as we know and understand that, when we are speaking, it is not just speaking, but actually we are always it is actually a representation of the thought process that is going behind. So basically when we are speaking out, it is already a structured or well very framed answers, no? Hmm. So then so that's where the complexity lies. When people are remembering their past, uh, our remembering and recollections are always affected by our present and how we understand. So during my research, when I was talking to these elderly people about the event of Kurechambu, and as I mentioned in the paper that after the Kurechambu there were so many uh, processes and activities that was carried out by the government, either to threaten people to not speak, or resist the new government, or through the processes of alliance building. So what happened over the period when at present I went to these elderly members to speak about the past. uh, so at first they were very very reluctant to speak about the past. Because they were worried that why I am collecting these informations. They thought that I might be coming from the government and trying to uh, do some investigation. So at first they used to ask me what they would ask me questions like what will you do with these uh, uh, interviews. Are you from the government department, which department you are working on, and etc etc. These kind of questions were there. So they would not speak. But then finally, there were many others who actually started speaking about the past. So basically, in very short, I mean, I was going into detail, but in very short, it is oral history is is a lot is about, you know, retrieving the memory. So while you are dealing with with memory, there you need to be very very careful about um, how this memory is being retrieved, recollected, and how now when they are speaking or narrating the past, how it is reframed. So looking at the context is very very important, and it's a challenge for all his researchers. So that's why in oral history, when we are doing oral history, we engage with the respondent or the interviewee for much very very longer period, you know, a year, more than a year, several years. You know, it's never you know, one day meeting and suddenly for 2 hours, you know, 2 hours interview and then that's over. Because as with memory, especially when you are engaging with elderly uh, members, what happens is, you know, the memories are sometimes broken. So one day they will remember a particular event, and then that might open up a very different avenues of, you know, understanding the past. So this is what is important. Secondly, especially when you are engaging with uh, with the past, which involves violence and trauma. Hmm. So people are not able to share uh, their stories, or you know, they do not want to go back to that memory. So it takes a lot of time, you know, building trust, and also at the same time, ultimately, if somebody is not willing to share or talk about that past, then you have to agree and understand uh, their interest, and you respect their agency of not speaking up. Then another part is, um, you know, when you're doing on oral history and somebody is telling their life story, uh, they are the, you know, the protagonist of that memory. Hmm. So often there again you will have to see what you are retrieving, whose interpretation you are taking, and why this interpretation is important. And that's why, as I mentioned in the paper, that it's not focused on, you know, truth uh, uh, telling, uh, but on the meaning. We are pursuing the meaning of that past, the experience, and how what people attribute to those memories and to those past. Coming to prospects, you know, this is why I decided to take up oral history method for my research, was because when I was trying to write local history of Kurichambio event, you know, as I said, that many people were unwilling to talk about the event. So the event as per. So when I reconstructed the entire interview schedule and interview method and plan as an oral history, so now the Kure Chambio event is not the focus of the story, but the entire life of that person, and Kure Chambio becomes just a part of his life, his or her life, uh, life story. And then, so this is what there was no official record. I went to different archives and tried to locate why there are files and files of documents on recording, you know, very uh, banal or very what about many things, somebody's leave application, somebody something, but this important, which is so significant for the community, is nowhere mentioned. The only document I found was in the National Archive in Delhi, and it is just 3 pages document, with 1 page missing in each, after with every alternative pages missing. And then I looked at what the official record says about the event, and then I compared it with the narratives, and it was telling a very different story. So what do you do when you're, if I depend only on oral this written accounts, that usually how the historians would go, then I get a very very different story about the Kore Chambio event. But it is only through the oral history method and through oral narration of past experiences of the community that I was able to retrieve the history of Kure Chambio and why that event took place. What are the uh, implications of that event on the community? Who were the participants, why they participated. So all these, if you want to write local history, that this is where people's memory is very very rich and I think that's all I should say as of now, in case if there are any other question.
Thank you so much, ma'am. So, is there any other question that we can address to ma'am? Ma'am, I have a question.
Sure.
During in the entire lecture, you had come up with the obstacles that you had faced as a researcher to bring about the evidences that you've spoken about. So, may I know how have you overcome those obstacles? And being a female researcher, we can still see in every field that we do face some of these obstacles. So has things changed from your time, or do we still have is this social stigma still incurring in the society as of today?
See, as I mentioned that I'm doing conducting these researches among oral communities who are very very dependent on oral traditions. So these oral traditions has several rules and regulations and conventions, and as I mentioned, that there are genres, different genres of oral traditions, and certain genres are not, open to women, not open for women to listen, and not open for women to, practice or recite those traditions. It is reserved only for men, and some of them are only for the priest or someone who has a very very good knowledge of miji and migu. So many of time the so-called oral tradition experts, they uh, they talk about oral traditions or the stories of the contents which has uh, uh, which has this violent death and people dying in past. So they explain, saying that whenever we enter into this story, you should know how it ends. You should know why and how you are framing that ending. So they describe this like opening a door, opening a door, and then you enter into that conversation, and you narrate that story, and you have to be very very careful about whose names you are taking, and uh, you know with a very very क्या, with very 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 detailed informations and events and the organization of time or events that take place, what happened, and then what led to what, the causality of that entire event, and then you arrive at the ending door. Hmm. And this door has to be closed very tightly, closed back very tightly. And how do you do that? You do that by the telling the story of how it ended, not violently, but how people have reconciled and negotiated to reconcile that event. And this is the understanding people have entered, and this happened to them, and that, and then so these details you need to have, and then you should have the strength to close the door. By strength, there they mean the knowledge and information that you have. So if you don't close the door properly, then what happened is the name that you have mentioned in entire story, people who have already died, you whenever you take their name, you are actually invoking their souls, and they listen to you. So when you don't close the door properly, what happens is, you let them loose. And that's why, as because of the patriarchal biases, women are considered as someone who has a weaker soul and a weaker spirit, might not be able to deal with those spirits, and might not be able to close the door. So that's why women are not allowed to speak or even listen to those stories. Then that is and that tradition and these norms and conventions still continues. And even now, these stories are usually called as aru, the matters of aru. And then women are not supposed to listen to here. I mean, even now people don't allow women to be participant in these stories. But of but changes have come. What I have noticed, especially, I had few respondents who had converted into Christianity, and a few respondents who are very well educated members of the community. They don't, continue in believing that women should be excluded from certain kind of narrations, and so they did share. That's how I was able to, get a certain information. But I would also like to mention that it depends on the researcher. It depends the kind of relation that you build with your respondents. Uh, you need to be empathetic. You need to accept their choices, and and uh, and that helps in building your trust, their trust on you. And you need to, give them uh, give them the choices and rights to, withdraw or not speak about certain things. And then when they see that, you are genuinely interested, and and you are going to interpret the story in a fashion that is agreeable to them. So then they do trust you, and then they share about their stories, despite these conventions that are there. But but again, this is what in oral history, what I personally practice is that, even if somebody has shared that story, if I feel that this might put the person in some kind of risk, or in some kind of situation which might cause them, affect them negatively in future. Say somebody, yeah. So I choose personally not to use that data, even if the respondent had said that, it's okay. So, and this is true especially for when you are engaging with elderly people. So, over the period, the kind of relation I built with those members, they they trusted me, and sometimes they shared the story as part of the story. When they are telling and they are engaging with in conversation, and they shared. And I was using my audio recorder. So, stories are sometimes shared in a moment or in the gist of the conversation that is going on. So then you as a researcher also has to be very, very responsible towards your respondents and their rights and well-being. So that's how it's a lot on the researcher's attitude towards their respondent and the entire process, that sometimes you are able to break those barriers. But 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 at the same time, those traditions still exist. These days we are seeing more and more female researchers, women researchers are coming up. Many are pursuing their PhDs and fields. So they do share about their challenges, but over the period, definitely these all will be things of past.
Thank you so much, ma'am,
Uh,
the
yeah,
explanation. Sir,
yes, yes. Actually, I have one query from ma'am. Can I
Yes,
ask?
yes, sure,
Okay.
sure, please do.
Yes, ma'am. So, do you notice any rites and rituals abandoned by the people today,
Hmm.
especially in your community or in Arunachal Pradesh? Or if it is, then why?
Hmm. Um, there are many rituals that are no more in practice. Um, some of them um, have you know not being practiced because the community decided to not continue with that practice. For example, if you have seen the pictures of our old ladies, so Apatanis have this facial tattoos and a big nose pin that we have here in both side of our nose. Uh, these practices of keeping slaves, practices of child marriage, and many other practices, these have gone away because the community members, especially the educated members, they felt because of their education and exposure to world outside, they felt these are practices which is no more meaningful for the community. In fact, it's what detrimental for the community to move forward, and also because of so these practices have gone away, but then there are other practices, rituals such as the one which is performed after somebody is murdered. Murdered because either they are caught committing some crime, or maybe during the raid or some conflict somebody dies. So those rituals are no more there, because again, all these changes have come because of after the coming of the so-called modernity, a modern way of life, and the coming of government, which again prohibits many of these practices. So they have definitely disappeared over the period, and I'm very very sure that there were many others which were there, which the practices which were there, but disappeared in past itself. Hmm. So those are there in Arunachal. I can speak mostly about Apatani, my tribe. The other tribes also had and has many such traditions which the communities are negotiating within themselves, if they should continue with certain practices or if they should discontinue in changing times. So,
Yes, ma'am.
Professor Saikya,
Yeah,
I
yeah.
mean, is it enough, or should I give you more
Yes,
examples?
ma'am. It's enough.
We
Yeah,
can
yeah.
have more discussions.
Yes, sure, sure,
So
ma'am.
basically, with time, many things have changed, and mm,
Yes,
uh, people are renegotiating with their traditions and past.
yes,
And today also, I'm part of this organization called Awaj, Patani Women Association of Zero.
yes, I
So
know.
they are working on something. They are working on something called Ditu, which means basically the rules and conventions.
Yes,
So it relates to certain traditions, say during the time of marriage, at the time of birth, at the time of death. So we organize certain ceremonies and feast. So this Ditupotu, through this Ditupotu document, people are trying to renegotiate, um, actually going back to the earlier traditions, because over the period there had been many modification that has come. So this to and fro processes are going on, and people are trying to get back to the older traditions and the original meaning of the why certain traditions and practices exist. So that is there.
Yes, ma'am. Yeah. Avi. Okay. Thank you, ma'am.
Yes, sir.
Yeah.
Thank you so much, ma'am, for your intricate lecture and the engaging. We had a good engaging our conversation and discussion. So with this, we come to the end of our program today. And to end, lastly, I would request my colleague Nungshilemla ma'am to give us the vote of thanks.
Thank you again for the time, ma'am. Uh, Most respected, distinguished speaker,
Thank you so much.
dignitaries, intellectuals, and all the participants. A very good evening once again. And then, on behalf of the Department of History, St. John College, I would like to propose a vote of thanks to everyone present here. So, firstly, I would extend my deepest gratitude to our speaker, Professor Rimi. Thank you for gracing our event and sharing your profound knowledge with us. As mentioned earlier, this is the last lecture of our lecture series, and undeniably, it has been an enlightening and informative series all along. So I'm very grateful to all the eminent speakers who have made every lecture very intriguing and very absorbing. I would also like to acknowledge the college administration for enabling this platform to organize such webinars amidst this pandemic. I appreciate the untiring efforts of our head of department history, Sir Mukhtar, and my colleague Abiruba for making this lecture series possible. And last but not the least, I cannot ignore the enthusiasm, the support, and cooperation of all the participants throughout this entire lecture series. So thank you, everyone. I believe the knowledge that we have received today will be disseminated to a wider audience. Thank you and have a pleasant evening.
Thank you so much, ma'am, for your wonderful vote of thanks. So, with this, we come to the end of our today's program and also to the lecture series that was organized by the Department of History, St. John College for this year. I hope that we shall meet again in our upcoming months with more and innovative lectures. So, thank you everyone for joining with us today, and hope that you actually gathered a lot of knowledge like us. So thank you, ma'am, for joining with us, giving your time, and actually enlightening us a lot about your community. Thank you, ma'am.
Thank you. It was my greatest pleasure to be speaking with the audience.
Thank you, ma'am. Pleasure is all ours.